The crisp air of September 2022 nipped at Adam Russo's face as he tightened the straps of his backpack. The man looked at the trailhead sign that marked his entrance to the Bob Marshall Wilderness. Bright orange warnings screamed of grisly activity. Adam couldn't help but smirk. He brushed the signs off with a wave, as if the signs could understand his gesture. Adam trusted himself above anything else. Years of hiking had taught him plenty. He carried bear spray and a knife. That would be enough. He began to climb, admiring the towering pines as they swayed gently. The forest felt so alive with the distant calls of birds. Adam loved the solitude, the pull of unspoiled nature. He wasn't a people person. He didn't trust people, but he trusted himself. The trail ahead was steep but manageable, weaving through valleys cloaked in golden aspen leaves. He noted every bend and landmark with practiced ease. By afternoon, he reached a clearing and paused for a quick lunch. The view was peaceful. The sun filtered through the trees, dappling his gear with light. Adam felt invincible. This, he knew, was how humans were supposed to live. He was proud to be one of the few who understood this truth. Montana's vast wilderness stretched around him, serene and still. The idea of danger seemed almost laughable. Let it come at him, and he would be ready. He pressed onward. The trail narrows as it climbs higher into the mountains. The dense canopy closed in, muting the sounds of the forest. The air grew heavier, perhaps because of a change in pressure. This stretch of the trail carried a strange smell, something musky that Adam couldn't quite place. His pace slowed. The ground was uneven here, the path littered with gnarled roots and fallen branches. The scent grew stronger, acrid and wild, but Adam dismissed it as part of the wilderness. And then, without a warning, the trail disappeared into a dense thicket. Adam hesitated, scanning for another route, but found none. The undergrowth was thick, the trail almost invisible, but he forged ahead. He had strong legs and good boots that crunched through dry leaves and twigs, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. And then, a guttural snort pierced the silence. Adam froze, heart hammering despite his previous conviction that he was above fear. As far as he could tell, the noise came from somewhere ahead, hidden in the underbrush. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound erupted again, this time sharper, closer. His breath quickened, and then almost stopped as a massive grizzly exploded from the thicket, a blur of muscle and fury. Its eyes locked on Adam. The man saw there was nothing behind those eyes, just rage. In that split second, Adam's instincts kicked in. His hand darted to his belt, fumbling for the canister of bear spray. The bear reared onto its hind legs, towering above him, a monstrous silhouette against the dim forest light. Adam pulled the trigger. The spray hissed, a bright orange cloud erupting into the air. But just as Adam thought he was saved, the wind turned. A gust whipped the mist back into his face, burning his eyes and throat. He staggered, choking, vision blurred. Panic surged through him, but there was no time to recover. The bear was already charging at him. Its sheer weight collided with him, a force that stole the breath from his lungs. Adam fell hard, the impact jolting through his body. He swung unthinkingly with the canister, doing little more than enraging it further. Claws raked across his chest. Pain exploded in his ribs as the bear's massive paw came down again, the weight crushing him into the dirt. Blood soaked his shirt, warm and sticky, pooling beneath him. He tried to scream, but the sound came out as a strangled gurgle. The bear's teeth found his shoulder, crunching down with bone-shattering force. Adam thrashed, his arms flailing weakly against the relentless attack. The forest spun around him in a dizzying blur of green and brown. Every nerve in his body screamed, the agony so intense it blurred the edges of his consciousness. Growling, the bear shook him like a rag doll, flinging his body aside. He landed in a heap, his head slamming against a tree trunk. Adam couldn't see as he struggled to move, fight, and survive. But the bear wasn't finished. It lunged again, its claws tearing into his throat. A wet, choking sound escaped Adam's lips as blood poured from the wound. The forest seemed to tilt, the light dimming as his body gave out. His limbs grew heavy, the pain fading into a cold numbness. Adam's final moments were a blur of sensations. The damp earth beneath him, the coppery taste of blood in his mouth, the distant caw of a raven overhead. The bear huffed and growled, its massive form retreating into the woods as suddenly as it had appeared. Silence fell and reigned supreme for days. Then, a search party found the site. They followed the faint trail of claw marks carved into trees, deep gouges that told the story of a struggle. Adam's belongings were scattered across the ground, his torn backpack, a mangled water bottle, and the crushed canister of bear spray. The ground was stained with dark, dried blood. Nearby, a twisted pile of branches marked where the bear had dragged its kill before abandoning it. The air was thick with the smell of decay. The claw marks on the trees loomed over the scene, a chilling reminder of the wilderness's raw, untamed power. For those who dared venture into its depths, the warnings were no longer just words on a sign. They were a promise. Jacob's family had been planning this trip for months. The San Juan Mountains of Colorado were a destination they had dreamed of visiting. Rugged peaks, endless forests, and crisp mountain air that seemed to cleanse the soul. It was an adventure for little Ellie beyond anything she had experienced in her 7 years. Her parents had told her about the wildlife, the hidden waterfalls, and the trails that twisted through fields of wildflowers. It sounded like magic, and Ellie wanted to be part of it. They set up camp near a clearing at the base of a towering ridgeline. The forest surrounded them in every direction, like a natural barrier. The soft hum of the leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl created a serene backdrop. Ellie was fascinated, her eyes wide with wonder as she explored the campsite, collecting pine cones and marveling at the towering pines. To her, it felt like stepping into another world. Her parents had warned her to stay close and not wander off. The wilderness, they reminded her, was beautiful but unpredictable. But Ellie's curiosity was boundless, and her small frame seemed charged with energy that wouldn't quit, even after a long day of hiking. Still, she managed to stay close. Everything was going so well for the family. But then, night fell, and with it came tragedy. The family decided to retreat into their tent as the sun dipped behind the mountains and shadows stretched across the forest floor. Little Ellie lay between her parents, wrapped in her sleeping bag, staring at the glowing embers of the campfire through the mesh of the tent flap. Exhaustion eventually pulled her into a light, restless sleep. Sometime in the night, Ellie stirred. A sound outside caught her attention. A rustling, faint but distinct. It didn't match the wind through the trees or the occasional snap of a distant branch. It was closer, deliberate. Ellie wondered if it was a forest fairy making the sounds out there. Her heart beat faster, but her curiosity overpowered her caution. Careful not to wake her parents, she slipped out of her sleeping bag, unzipping the tent quietly. She wanted to see and maybe even befriend the fairy. The cool night air hit her face as she stepped outside. The fire had died to a faint glow, and the campsite was bathed in shadows. The rustling grew louder near the picnic table where they had stored their supplies. Ellie's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she moved toward the sound, her small feet crunching softly on the gravel. And then she froze. That was no fairy scavenging through their supplies. No, it was a black bear, its hulking form illuminated faintly by the moonlight. The animal was rummaging through their cooler. Its head bobbed as it sniffed, tearing into a bag of jerky they had forgotten to pack away properly. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen anything so massive, so wild up close. She knew bears could be dangerous, but she was too young to grasp the full gravity of the situation. Instead of retreating, she stepped closer, drawn by fear and fascination. The bear stopped. Its head swung toward her, eyes glinting. The animal froze, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Ellie's small movement had startled it, and for a moment, the two stood locked in a silent standoff. Then the bear charged. Ellie screamed, the sharp sound shattering the stillness of the night. Her parents jolted awake inside the tent, disoriented by the noise and outside movement. The bear reached Ellie in two powerful strides, its claws raking across her small body as she tried to turn and flee. She fell hard onto the dirt, the impact knocking the wind out. The bear's jaws clamped down on her arm, its massive weight dragging her effortlessly toward the forest's edge. Her parents scrambled out of the tent, their panicked shouts echoing through the trees. They grabbed whatever they could find. Pots, rocks, anything to throw at the animal. A heavy skillet struck the bear's side, and it reared up with a deep, guttural roar, momentarily loosening its grip on Ellie. But instead of retreating, it redoubled its efforts, clamping its jaws around her small torso and hauling her farther into the woods. Blood streaked the ground where the bear dragged Ellie, her cries growing weaker as the forest swallowed them. Her parents chased after the bear, screaming and hurling rocks, but their efforts were futile. The bear's power was overwhelming, its movements fluid and unstoppable. It disappeared into the dense underbrush within moments, taking Ellie with it. The hours that followed were a nightmare. The family called for help, their desperate cries piercing the dark wilderness. Rangers arrived quickly, armed and grim-faced, knowing the gravity of a bear attack. Tracking dogs were brought in, their noses to the bloodied trail that led deeper into the forest. Bloodstains led them farther into the woods, a haunting breadcrumb trail that spoke of Ellie's final moments. When they found her, Ellie's small body was deeply mauled, her clothing ripped and stained with blood. The bear had consumed much of her, a horrifying proof of the primal laws of survival in the wild. Her arm bent at an unnatural angle, her face pale and unrecognizable. Nearby, the bear was found and killed. No one wanted that animal to haunt the forest anymore. The scene was one of silence and despair, the raw power of nature leaving no room for solace. The San Juan Mountains stood unchanged by the unspeakable tragedy. This wilderness, one of Colorado's most stunning landscapes, was also one of its most unforgiving. Ellie's parents never recovered from their loss. Ellie's story would be a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder to respect the wild and its unpredictable inhabitants. But for her family, no words could capture the depth of their loss. No explanation could ease the pain. Only the mountains remained, silent witnesses to a night they would never forget. 2023, Hannah Moore sat on the porch of her Firewatch cabin. It was a golden June sunset in Montana, casting long shadows over the treetops of a national park. At 29, Hannah had spent the past 3 summers in solitude, perched high in the wilderness. The days were long but rewarding, and her duty was clear: monitor the landscape for signs of fire, and protect the park's vast natural beauty. That night, the forest was alive with the hum of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves. After logging her daily observations, Hannah cooked a simple dinner, savoring the quiet. The cabin, a modest structure of weathered wood, was her sanctuary. She felt safe here, even in the heart of Grizzly country. Hannah cleaned up carefully, mindful of food scents that could attract wildlife. She double-checked her logs before retiring to bed, and her flashlight and emergency radio were within reach. As the hours passed, the forest grew quieter, the shadows outside deepening. The hum of the wilderness lulled her to sleep the way it did every night. But then, Hannah heard a noise piercing through the thick veil of her sleep. The noise jarred her awake. It started faint, a rhythmic scraping sound that seemed to come from outside. Hannah sat up, her pulse quickening. The air felt oppressive, the kind of stillness that promised danger. She moved cautiously to the window, peering into the moonlit clearing around the cabin. Her stomach dropped. A massive grizzly bear prowled near the fire pit, its powerful frame illuminated in the moon's silver light. It took its time sniffing the air. Each movement was slow, almost calculated. Hannah's eyes darted to the nearby storage shed, where the remnants of food from a previous camper might have lingered despite the strict bear-safe protocols. The bear's grumbles grew louder as it pawed at the ground, claws scraping against the rocky soil. Hannah's mind raced. She knew she couldn't let the bear linger. Bears that associated humans with food became unpredictable, even deadly. She grabbed a flashlight and a metal fire poker, steeling herself before stepping onto the porch. The bear turned as the beam of light swept across its face. Hannah banged the fire poker against the railing, shouting to drive it away. The bear's ears flattened, and a deep growl filled the air. Hannah barely had time to react as the bear charged. She stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight as the bear barreled toward her. The porch creaked under its weight, the wood splintering as it swiped at her with a massive paw. She scrambled inside, slamming the door shut and locking it as the bear collided with the other side. The cabin shook as the bear rammed the door again and again. Hannah backed away, clutching the fire poker with trembling hands. She knew the thin wooden walls wouldn't hold forever. The grizzly growled, its sheer power radiating through the cabin. Then came the sound of breaking glass. The bear had found the window. The cunning animal forced its way inside, its claws raking against the window frame as shards of glass rained onto the floor. Hannah swung the fire poker, striking its snout with all her strength. The bear roared, momentarily recoiling, but its rage only grew. It lunged, swiping at her with claws that tore through her shirt and raked across her side. Adrenaline drove her forward. She swung again, aiming for the animal's massive head, but the poker slipped from her grasp as the bear charged. Its weight knocked her onto the table, breaking one of the legs and sending her crashing to the floor. Furniture splintered and toppled as the bear advanced, baring its teeth. Hannah scrambled to her feet, grabbing a chair to shield herself. The bear swiped, shattering the chair into pieces and knocking her back into the corner of the room. Blood dripped from the wounds on her arm and chest, staining the floor as the bear closed the distance. It lunged again, grabbing her leg and dragging her toward the shattered window. She clawed at the floorboards, desperate to hold on, but the bear's strength was overwhelming. Her fingernails scraped against the wood as she was pulled outside, her screams echoing into the night. Hannah knew that it was over. She didn't believe in miracles, but she prayed that her suffering would end quickly. The struggle ended beneath the trees. The bear's powerful jaws clamped down on her neck, silencing her cries. Its claws raked across her torso, leaving deep, fatal wounds. The forest grew quiet once more, the grizzly standing over its prey. It tore at her flesh. The rangers arrived the next morning, alerted by a missed check-in on Hannah's radio. The scene was a testament to the violence of the night. Bloodstains streaked the porch, and the cabin's interior was in shambles. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. The table collapsed, and glass shards glittered in the morning light. Outside, they found her body near the edge of the forest, sprawled amidst the underbrush as though the ruthless predator had discarded her. Her clothing hung in shreds, the fabric torn and soaked with blood, clinging to her battered body. Deep gashes from the bear's claws ran across her torso, jagged and raw, while her neck bore the unmistakable puncture wounds of its crushing bite. The ground around her was disturbed, dirt and leaves kicked up in chaotic swirls, telling the story of a desperate and futile struggle for survival. A trail of blood led from the shattered window of the cabin to where she lay, smeared across rocks and broken branches. The sheer volume of it painted a grim picture of her final moments, each mark telling the story of the grizzly's savage strength. The rangers moved methodically through the scene, their expressions grim as they documented the evidence of what had transpired. Each bloodstain, shattered piece of furniture, and disturbed patch of earth spoke to the chaos and violence of Hannah's final moments. They worked silently, their duty clear, but weighed down by the knowledge that no care or diligence could undo what had happened. For Hannah Moore, the national park in Montana had been a place of purpose and solitude, but that same isolation had turned deadly. The lake was still, its surface glassy under the pale light of an overcast afternoon. Tom and his 11-year-old son, Evan, sat on the edge of their small aluminum boat, the boy reeling in a modest catch while his father cleaned the morning's haul. The air smelled faintly of pine and strongly of fish, and the only sounds were the lapping of water against the hull and the occasional cry of a distant bird. It felt serene, almost idyllic. Tom had always wanted to take Evan on a fishing trip to Alaska, but the boy had been too small and frail. Now, at 11 years old, Evan was a strong boy with a good head on his shoulders. Tom knew his son could appreciate the beauty of the wilderness and learn a thing or two about nature. But then, everything changed. They were on their boat, gleefully chatting. Tom noticed the bear first. It appeared on the shoreline, a hulking mass of brown fur and raw power. It stood still, its head low as it sniffed the air, drawn by the smell of fresh fish. The boat was anchored about 30 yards from shore, but the distance offered little comfort. Tom's stomach knotted. Grizzlies weren't uncommon in this part of Alaska, but a curious bear was one thing. An aggressive one was another. The bear moved closer to the water's edge, its massive paws sinking into the muddy bank. Tom gestured to Evan to stay quiet, his mind racing through their options. They could row back to the opposite side of the lake, but the bear was already fixated on them, its eyes locked onto the boat. Evan's fishing rod dipped, the line snapping taut as he hooked a fish. The sound of the reel spinning seemed to irritate the bear. It let out a low growl. A deep sound carried across the water. Tom's hands trembled as he grabbed the oars. He didn't need to tell Evan to reel in the line. The boy had already abandoned the rod, his eyes wide with fear. The bear entered the water, wading in with slow, deliberate steps. Its fur rippled with each movement, and the lake's surface shuddered around it. Tom began rowing, each pull of the oars frantic and uneven. The boat lurched forward, but needed to be quicker. The bear's pace quickened, its bulk moving unnervingly through the shallows. Evan clung to the side of the boat, his knuckles white. Tom threw one of the fish he had cleaned into the water, hoping to distract the animal. The fish landed with a splash, and for a moment, the bear paused. It sniffed the air again, its gaze shifting between the floating fish and the boat. But the reprieve was brief. The bear ignored the fish and surged forward, its powerful strokes cutting through the water like a knife. Its eyes were on the bigger prize. The first swipe came without warning. The bear rose onto its hind legs, its massive paw slamming against the boat's side. The impact rocked the vessel violently, sending water sloshing over the edge. Evan screamed, clutching at his father as the ship tilted dangerously. Tom shouted for him to stay low, his voice barely audible over his heart pounding. Tom grabbed another fish and hurled it toward the bear, then another, his hands slick with blood and water. The bear growled, its mouth pulling back to reveal yellow teeth, but it was undeterred. Another swipe cracked the side of the boat, leaving deep gouges in the aluminum. The vessel tipped, and Tom knew they had seconds before it capsized. The bear lunged again, catching the boat's edge and flipping it with a furious twist. Tom and Evan plunged into the icy water, the cold stealing their breath. Tom surfaced first, gasping, his hands frantically searching for his son. Evan appeared a few feet away, his eyes wide with terror. Tom bellowed at Evan to swim. The bear was thrashing toward them. Its claws churned the lake into a froth, its growls muffled but no less terrifying. Tom spotted a rocky outcrop jutting from the water about 20 feet away. It was their only chance. He swam toward Evan, grabbing the boy's arm and pulling him alongside. The weight of his soaked clothes dragged at him, his muscles burning with each stroke, but he didn't stop. Behind them, the bear closed the distance, its massive head cutting through the water relentlessly. Tom's foot hit something solid, the rocks. He shoved Evan forward, urging him to climb. The boy scrambled onto the slippery surface, his fingers clawing for purchase. Tom followed, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he hauled himself up just as the bear reached the base of the outcrop. The bear reared up on its hind legs, swiping at the rocks. Its claws scraped against the stone, sending splinters of rock flying. Evan pressed himself against his father, his small frame shaking with fear. Tom scanned their surroundings, searching desperately for anything they could use to defend themselves. There was nothing, just water and stone. The bear roared, reverberating in Tom's chest like a drumbeat. It tried to climb, its claws gouging into the rock, but the surface was too steep and slick. Still, it didn't retreat. It circled the outcrop, pacing, growling, its dark eyes fixed on them. Time passed in agonizing increments. Tom held Evan close, their bodies trembling from the cold and adrenaline. Every sound, the rustle of wind, the ripple of water, felt amplified, each one a reminder of how close they had come to death. Finally, a distant noise broke through the tension, the whine of an engine growing louder. Tom turned, spotting a small boat cutting across the lake. Rescue. He waved his arms, shouting, his voice raw. The bear growled again, but began to retreat, sensing the approach of humans. It waded back into the forest, its massive form vanishing into the trees as quickly as it had appeared. The rescue team pulled them from the outcrop, their faces pale with shock at the scene. Tom and Evan sat huddled together, their bodies shaking from the cold and the sheer magnitude of what they had survived. That night, as they wrapped themselves in blankets by the fire, the bear's roar echoed in their memories. The lake was silent again, but the peace it once held was shattered forever. The campfire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the cool night air. Sarah lay in the tent, her sleeping bag zipped tightly around her. Nearby, her brother's breathing was slow and steady, the rhythm of someone deep in sleep. The forest around them was still, with a quiet chorus of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Sarah felt safe. The campsite was familiar terrain, and after years of camping experience, Sarah had taken every precaution to ensure Alex and her would be safe. Their food was stored in a bear-proof container, sealed tight and tucked away from the tent. The only oversight, a small cooler left outside. A careless mistake she hadn't thought twice about, until she heard the sound. It was subtle at first, a muffled scrape that barely registered. Then came the distinct thud of the cooler lid snapping open, followed by the clatter of its contents spilling onto the ground. Sarah's eyes flew open, her body stiff with sudden awareness. She strained her ears, and there it was, a heavy, deliberate snuffling, the unmistakable sound of an animal rooting through their things. Her blood ran cold. She instinctively knew it was a bear. She reached out to Alex, shaking his shoulder, her movements quick but silent. His eyes fluttered open, and she pressed a finger to her lips, motioning for him to stay quiet. He nodded, his face pale in the dim light of the tent. Carefully, Sarah unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The moonlight cast long shadows across the campsite. There it was, no more than 15 feet away. A large black bear loomed over the cooler, its massive paws swiping through the scattered contents. Empty wrappers and crushed cans littered the ground. The bear's sheer size was overwhelming, its dark fur blending with the shadows, and its bulk was a stark reminder of its raw power. Sarah's mind raced. They needed to scare it off before it grew more comfortable, or worse, turned its attention to the tent. She grabbed the flashlight beside her sleeping bag and clicked it on, aiming the beam directly at the bear. The bright light startled it, and it paused, lifting its massive head to stare at her. The moment hung in the air, electric with tension. Then, instead of retreating, the bear huffed and took a step closer, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling mix of curiosity and determination. Sarah's stomach dropped. This bear wasn't going to be scared off easily, but Sarah was brave, especially since her brother's life was at stake. She crawled out of the tent, moving slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Staying low, she grabbed a metal pot from their cooking gear and banged it against the flashlight, creating as much noise as possible. The sound echoed through the forest, sharp and jarring. The bear hesitated, its ears flattening briefly, but then it advanced again, its focus unwavering. Sarah backed up, her feet crunching against the gravel as she tried to distance herself from the bear. Her movements were calculated and deliberate, but inside, panic churned. She had to keep it away from the tent, from Alex. Then, in a blur of motion, the bear lunged, its massive paw swept out, claws extended. Sarah barely had time to react. Pain shot through her leg as the claws raked against her thigh, tearing through fabric and flesh. She stumbled, falling hard onto her back, the flashlight skittering out of her grasp. The bear loomed over her, its breath hot and stinky, its growl vibrating through the ground beneath her. Alex burst from the tent, a sharp cry escaping him as he saw the scene. Before Sarah could shout for him to stay back, he grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it with all his strength. The rock struck the bear's shoulder, not hard enough to injure but enough to distract. The bear turned, its growl deepening, and for a split second, Its attention shifted. "Run!" Sarah's mind screamed, her instincts kicking in. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her leg, and grabbed Alex's arm. Together, they sprinted toward the car parked just beyond the campsite. The bear roared behind them, the sound primal and terrifying, its heavy footfalls pounding against the ground. Sarah's lungs burned, her injured leg screaming with every step, but she didn't dare stop. The car came into view, a lifeline in the darkness. She fumbled for the keys in her pocket, her fingers slick with sweat and shaking uncontrollably. The bear was close, too close. She could feel its presence, its hulking form bearing down on them as they reached the car. She yanked the door open, shoving Alex inside before throwing herself in and slamming the door shut. The bear reached the car a heartbeat later, its massive body slamming against the side with a metallic thud. The vehicle rocked under the impact, the windows vibrating as the bear pawed at the doors. Its growls filled the small space, deafening and relentless. Sarah's hands trembled as she jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. She hit the gas, the tires spinning against the gravel before catching. The car lurched forward, putting distance between them and the enraged bear. In the rearview mirror, she saw it standing in the middle of the road, its dark silhouette illuminated by the red glow of the taillights. It huffed, pawed at the ground, and finally turned back toward the campsite. Sarah didn't stop driving until they reached the ranger station miles away. Only then did she let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her leg throbbed, the wound shallow but bleeding, a stark reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. Alex sat beside her, silent and pale, his wide eyes fixed on the dashboard. As the Rangers tended to her injury and began planning to deal with the bear, Sarah's thoughts were consumed by a single, unshakable truth. They had survived. Barely. The dense canopy of the Adirondacks filtered sunlight into scattered beams, casting long shadows over the forest floor. James moved carefully along the rugged trail, his hiking boots crunching against loose stones and fallen leaves. Miles from the nearest road, he finally enjoyed the solitude he craved. His pack was light, his steps confident, and the only sound was the rustle of wind through the trees. Barely 30 yards ahead, a black bear stood on its hind legs, its broad head buried in a thick patch of berry bushes. James froze mid-step, his heart thundering in his chest. The bear's coat shone jet black, its muscles rippling under its fur. It hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on stripping the bush clean of its small red fruit. James began to back away slowly, his body tense, his breath shallow. His mind raced through everything he'd read about bear encounters. No sudden movements, no loud noises. Make yourself appear non-threatening. Each step back felt like an eternity. The forest suddenly alive with every snapping twig and crunch of undergrowth. But when his boot caught on a loose rock, sending it skittering down the slope with a sharp clatter, James knew he was out of luck. And when the bear's head snapped up and its dark eyes locked onto James, unblinking, the man knew he was in deep trouble. The animal dropped to all fours, its posture low and predatory. A growl rumbled from its chest. James felt rooted to the spot, his muscles frozen in terror. James spun and bolted, his legs carrying him blindly through the dense forest. Branches whipped at his face, and the uneven terrain threatened to send him sprawling. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the bear barreling toward him, closing the distance with each thundering step. Desperation clawed at him as he spotted a tree with thick, low branches. His instinct screamed at him to climb. Reaching the base, he threw himself at the trunk, gripping the rough bark as he hauled himself up. His arms burned, and his fingers slipped on the mossy surface, but adrenaline drove him upward. The sound of snapping branches below told him the bear was following. James reached a sturdy branch and pulled himself onto it, panting, his chest heaving. But when he looked down, his heart sank. The bear was already climbing, its massive claws easily digging into the bark, its teeth bared as it growled, saliva dripping from its jaws. James gripped his hiking stick, the only weapon he had. As the bear lunged closer, he swung it with all his strength. The stick connected with the bear's snout, the crack echoing through the forest. The bear roared in pain. Its grip faltered, and it slid down the trunk, clawing to regain footing. James didn't wait to see if it would recover. He scrambled higher, his arms and legs trembling. The bear growled again but didn't follow. Instead, it dropped to the ground, pacing in agitated circles. James clung to the tree, his chest heaving. his hands trembling around the stick. His pulse hammered in his ears as he watched the bear retreat into the shadows, growling one last time before disappearing into the forest. James allowed himself to breathe deeply when the forest grew silent again. His body throbbed with pain, his arms from climbing, his ribs where a branch had jabbed him during his frantic ascent. He looked down at his scattered gear, much of it tossed in his panicked flight. His pack was torn open, its contents strewn across the ground. The bear had ripped through it, and his food was gone. He climbed down cautiously, his legs wobbling as they touched the ground. The stick, splintered from the impact, was still clutched in his hand. He scanned the area for any sign of the bear. The woods were eerily quiet, but he knew better than to trust the silence. James gathered what he could: a half-empty water bottle, an emergency blanket, and a small knife that had miraculously strapped to his belt. He found a patch of clear ground and set to work, his mind racing through survival techniques. His hands shook as he gathered fallen branches and lashed them together to form a crude shelter against a rocky outcrop. It was far from perfect, but it offered some semblance of protection. Night fell quickly, the forest plunging into darkness. James sat under the makeshift shelter, his body stiff with tension. Every sound, every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent his pulse racing. He kept the broken hiking stick by his side, clutching the knife in his other hand. With trembling fingers, the fire he managed to light offered little comfort, its small flames casting flickering shadows that seemed to move independently. The hours dragged on. Sleep was impossible. James's mind replayed the encounter, the bear's roar, the flash of its teeth, the crushing weight of its presence. He stayed vigilant, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Dawn broke slowly, the pale light filtering through the trees. Exhausted and aching, James packed what little he had left and began the trek back toward the trailhead. Every step felt like a risk, every rustle in the bushes a potential threat. His senses were heightened, his body primed to run at the slightest sign of danger. As he neared a clearing, he heard voices, human voices. Relief flooded through him as he stumbled into a group of hikers, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity as they saw his torn clothes and battered face. One radioed for help, and James was soon escorted out of the wilderness. The weight of his ordeal didn't fully hit him until he was safely in the back of a rescue vehicle, the dense forest shrinking in the rear-view mirror. The image of the bear stayed with him, its eyes, its growl, the raw power that had come so close to ending him. He survived, but the wilderness had left its mark, a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. And as the adrenaline faded, James couldn't shake the feeling that the bear, somewhere deep in the Adirondacks, remembered him too. It dawned on June 18th, 2024, in Montana's Bitterroot Range. The jagged peaks loomed against the pale morning sky, their shadows stretching across an untamed wilderness that promised beauty and danger. Here, Gary Mills, a seasoned hunter with decades of experience stalking everything from deer to wolves, felt alive and powerful. Adrenaline was coursing through his veins. Gary was hunting. But today's quarry was no mere trophy. It was a grizzly bear, a beast that tested even the most skilled hunters. Gary relished the challenge. He felt that hunting a grizzly would prove his abilities once and for all. As the hours passed, Gary scouted the rugged terrain. The forest was alive with the rustle of leaves and distant calls of birds, but his focus was razor sharp. Near noon, he spotted a massive, tawny shape in a sunlit meadow below. He crouched, scanning the animal through his rifle scope. The bear appeared dead. Gary couldn't tell whether it was breathing, but it seemed not to. A dark streak of what might have been blood stained the grass nearby. It looked wounded, perhaps from a fight with another predator or a careless hunter's stray bullet. Caution and instinct were at war inside Gary. Bears were unpredictable, and even a mortally wounded one could unleash devastation. Yet the creature lay so still, its massive frame oddly slack. Gary decided to move closer. The meadow was silent as he descended, the ground soft beneath his boots. He kept his rifle ready but lowered its safety. 20 yards became 10, then 5. The bear remained still, its fur rippling faintly in the breeze. Its eyes were closed, and its mouth hung slightly open, revealing yellowed teeth. Gary circled it slowly, his boots brushing against tufts of wild grass. He paused, leaning in to inspect the dark stain. Blood. It's fresh, but only a little. Perhaps the bear had succumbed to internal injuries. Still, something about its posture seemed wrong, too deliberate. Gary's gut twisted as he bent closer. The bear's muscles tensed almost too quickly for Gary to notice, then sprang to life. It exploded upward with a roar that shattered the quiet. It looked like a god of old, a creature of sound and fury. Gary stumbled back, his mind racing to catch up with the shift from hunter to prey. The bear was no longer an injured target, but a predator in its prime, and Gary had walked straight into its trap. The man knew this wasn't normal bear behavior, but there was no time to ponder the implications. He had to act. But before he could move, the rifle flew from his grasp as the bear's massive paw swiped at him with bone-shaking force. Gary was thrown to the ground, gasping from shock. The bear looked at him with eyes full of primal rage. Saliva was dripping from its jaws, staining the ground beneath. Gary scrambled to his feet, instinct screaming for him to run, but the bear was faster. It lunged, its claws raking through the air. He dodged, barely avoiding another blow, and reached for his knife. His hands fumbled with the sheath, slippery with sweat and blood. The bear lunged again, knocking him back into the dirt. Jaws and claws, claws and jaws. It was all Gary could see. The man felt the bear's hot breath on his face as its maw closed inches from his neck. But Gary still had a little fight in him. The man lashed out wildly, the blade in his hand finally finding purchase. The bear roared again, more enraged than wounded, and slammed him against the ground. Gary couldn't think straight anymore. Pain and the need to survive. These two feelings were overwhelming. Gary kicked, punched, and slashed, but the bear's mass pinned him down. Each swipe of its claws tore through his clothing and flesh, leaving him gasping in agony. The forest echoed with their struggle, the crack of breaking branches, the bear's guttural growls, and Gary's labored breaths. Gary managed to roll away. He crawled toward the rifle, but the bear charged again. He reached the weapon and turned just as the bear descended. The rifle was wrenched from his hands again, this time crushed under the animal's weight. A final swipe sent him sprawling, his vision swimming with stars. The bear loomed over him. It bit his arm. The bone snapped with a gut-twisting sound. Gary screamed, but there was no one there to hear his screams. There was no escape. The bear's teeth tore through muscle and bone, its claws shredding what remained of his resistance. A pool of blood started to pool beneath him as his strength ebbed away. His mind drifted, the pain fading into a strange, detached clarity. He had underestimated the beast and misjudged the signs. The grizzly wasn't merely surviving, it was thriving, and he had been foolish to assume otherwise. And then Gary was gone, his body broken and lifeless. The meadow was quiet again, except for the bear's heavy breathing as it continued to maul him. When search parties found Gary's remains days later, the scene was indication enough of his fate. His rifle lay twisted and bent, his body torn and bloodied. The meadow, once serene, bore the scars of a violent struggle. The story spread quickly, igniting debates about hunting ethics and humanity's place in the wild. Some called Gary reckless, a thrill-seeker who got what he deserved. Others mourned him as a victim of nature's harsh unpredictability. No matter the case, Gary Mills was gone. The bear was never found. It remained unseen, untouchable, the only victor of the deadly incident. The Bitterroot Range and its wilderness continued undisturbed. It was the 3rd of August 2022, and Marcus Keegan was about to begin his run on the trail ahead. At 32 years old, Marcus was a seasoned athlete and a professional marketing executive. But running in the wilderness was where he felt complete. He had been visiting a national forest in Wyoming for years, captivated by its wild beauty. It was the first federally protected national forest in the United States, covering millions of acres and preserving landscapes that had remained untouched for centuries. Marcus found freedom here, running through the dense forests and craggy peaks, his mind free from deadlines and conference calls. The late August morning was cool as Marcus set off on his usual route, weaving through the forest trails. The National Forest's biodiversity was legendary, ranging from sagebrush plains to dense fir forests. He had often marveled at the wildlife: elk grazing in the meadows, the occasional moose stepping cautiously into view. Grizzlies were a known danger, but Marcus had never seen one up close. He carried bear spray in his pack, a precaution he hoped he'd never need. The trail opened into a clearing before narrowing again, bordered by towering spruces. Marcus felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as he picked up his pace. His strides were fluid, his breathing steady. Today he wanted to push himself further. A faint side trail caught his attention, winding into thicker, unexplored terrain. Marcus hesitated briefly before veering off. He enjoyed the thought of discovering something new, but as Marcus ran deeper, the forest grew darker. The smell of pine and damp earth was stronger there, in the heart of the wilderness. Marcus realized he needed to slow his pace. There were fallen branches and overgrown roots. The National Forest in Wyoming had never been heavily settled, retaining much of its original wildness. Native Americans had lived here for at least 10,000 years, coexisting with the land's untamed beauty. Marcus thought briefly of the explorers like John Coulter, who had first documented this place centuries ago. The underbrush thickened, and Marcus stopped to sip water. His surroundings were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves replaced by an oppressive stillness. It may be time to go back to the main trail. But no, he wanted to explore more. Marcus moved forward, his steps cautious now. A faint metallic scent lingered in the air. Then, Marcus saw the source of the scent. A massive deer carcass lay sprawled across the forest floor, its ribs exposed, flesh torn. The sight froze Marcus in his tracks. His heart pounded as he scanned the area. He knew the risks of predators guarding a kill, but a low, guttural growl rumbled through the trees before he could act. Marcus felt like he was in a low-budget horror movie for a second. He turned, eyes wide, just in time to see the grizzly emerging from the shadows faster than any creature Marcus had ever seen. Its fur and snout were caked with blood. In that instant, Marcus knew he had stumbled into a feeding zone and that the bear saw him as a threat. Marcus ran, not waiting to see if the bear charged. He sprinted with every ounce of strength, his legs pounding the uneven ground. Branches whipped at his face as he tore through the forest, his breath coming in panicked gasps. But the bear was faster. A creature weighing nearly 800 pounds could cover ground at speeds no human could match. Marcus felt its thunderous steps closing in, the earth trembling beneath him. And then, a huge, heavy paw slammed into his back, raking his flesh. Marcus was hurled forward, landing hard against the forest floor. He tried to crawl away, but it was no use. The bear was already on him. Its nauseating jaws clamped down on his shoulder, crushing muscle and bone. Marcus screamed, the sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The bear released him briefly, circling with low, menacing growls. Marcus tried to rise, his arms trembling, but the bear struck again, dragging him through the dirt. Blood poured from the wounds on his back and neck, soaking into the earth. As he watched the forest spin, Marcus knew he was slipping away from the rope of his battered and broken body. But his mind clung to survival. He reached for the bear spray strapped to his waist with shaking hands. He managed to unclip it, fumbling to aim as the bear loomed over him. He fired. The spray erupted in a cloud, striking the bear's face. The animal roared in rage, momentarily retreating, swiping its head against the ground. Marcus seized the chance, dragging himself away. His vision blurred and his strength waned. He knew he couldn't outrun it. His only hope was to hide. But the bear recovered quickly. It found him again, its keen senses leading it back to its wounded prey. Marcus barely registered the next attack as the bear's claws tore into his back, shredding his flesh, his muscles, and his lungs. The pain was beyond anything he had ever known, drowning him in agony. The bear raked its claws down his legs, ensuring its dominance, then bit into his neck with a final devastating force. Then, darkness. Marcus was gone. The forest fell silent again, save for the bear's heavy breathing and the distant rustle of leaves. When Marcus failed to return home, his girlfriend Lexi alerted the authorities. A search team combed the area, but the national forest's vast wilderness made the search painstaking. Finally, they found what remained of Marcus after his disappearance. His body was partially buried, covered in dirt and leaves, a behavior bears use to protect kills from scavengers. Claw gouges, a mixture of soil, broken twigs, and blood-stained debris, marked the mound of disturbed earth. Now caked with mud, his once bright running shoes lay a few feet away, one twisted awkwardly as though flung in his desperate final moments. A shattered water bottle, its plastic sides punctured and torn, glinted faintly in the dappled sunlight breaking through the dense canopy above. Nearby, strips of torn fabric from his vest clung to low-hanging branches, fluttering like grim flags of surrender in the faint breeze. The metallic tang of blood and decay hung thick in the air, mingling with the earthy scent of pine and moss. Flies buzzed incessantly, drawn to the macabre scene, their droning hum the only sound in the otherwise stillness. The forest stood indifferent around the site, its ancient trees casting long shadows over the remnants of Marcus's final stand. For Marcus Keegan, the wilderness he loved had become where he drew his last breath, a place as beautiful as it was indifferent to human suffering. 2024, Carl Anders sat on a rock by the rushing river, the cold October air biting his face. At 47, fishing was his escape, a reprieve from the monotony of his desk job. Every fall, he made the trek to Kodiak Island, timing his trip with the salmon run. It was a ritual he cherished, the solitude, the wildness, the thrill of reeling in a fish from waters teeming with life. This year was no different. The river was alive with silver flashes of salmon fighting against the current, and Carl felt a familiar rush of anticipation. The morning had been fruitful. His cooler already held several large salmon, their scales shimmering even in the overcast light. He'd chosen this spot for its isolation, far from other fishermen and just a short hike from his campsite. The sound of the river was soothing, and the dense forest around him was a barrier to the outside world. Carl knew the risks. Kodiak Island was grizzly country, and the bears were especially active during the salmon run. Signs warning of recent bear sightings dotted the trailhead, but Carl had shrugged them off. He wasn't reckless. He carried bear spray on his belt and kept his wits about him. But years of fishing these waters had made him confident, perhaps too much. The first sign of trouble came with a shift in the air. A faint crack of branches reached Carl's ears, barely audible over the rushing water. He turned, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. He chalked it up to the wind or a smaller animal moving through the underbrush and returned to his fishing. Moments later, another sound, closer this time, a low grunt. Carl stiffened. He instinctively knew this was no small animal. Slowly, he turned his head. Emerging from the shadows of the forest was a grizzly bear. It was a huge beast, oozing power, promising nothing but danger, its eyes locked onto Carl's cooler, its keen nose undoubtedly catching the scent of fresh salmon. Why hunt if someone had already hunted for you? Carl's heart raced, but he didn't run. He knew better than to trigger the bear's predatory instincts. Running would turn him into prey, he had no doubt. Instead, Carl stood his ground, grabbing a nearby stick. He waved it and shouted, his voice echoing off the trees. The bear listened and watched closely, its ears twitching. For a brief moment, Carl dared to hope it might retreat. But the bear wasn't even remotely afraid. It was hungry. It charged without wasting any more time. Carl barely had time to react before it was on him, as agile as it was powerful. The bear swiped with its paw, sending the stick flying and knocking Carl backward. He stumbled, his foot slipping on the slick rocks, and fell into the icy water. Carl stood no chance. The current dragged him briefly, but he fought to regain his footing, clawing at the rocks to pull himself upright. The bear followed, plunging into the water with a ferocity that sent waves splashing against the banks. Carl scrambled, his hands grasping at anything solid, but the bear was too fast. Its claws raked across his back, tearing through his jacket and into his flesh. Pain seared through Carl's body as he was thrown face first into the river. He tried to get away, his hands slipping on the blood-slick rocks, but the bear was relentless. It lunged again, its powerful claws slicing through the man's flesh. Carl screamed, the sound drowned by the roar of the river. There was no pattern to the attack. The bear dragged him toward the bank, its claws tearing into his chest as it pinned him down. Blood sprayed across the rocks, mixing with the foamy water. Carl flailed, his movements growing weaker as shock set in. He felt the bear's teeth and claws sink into his side, the pain so intense it blurred his vision. His breaths came in ragged gasps, each one harder than the last. The bear roared, its breath hot and foul against Carl's face. It stood over him, its weight pressing him into the ground. He could feel his strength fading, his body giving out under the relentless assault. The last thing he saw was the bear's dark eyes, wild and unyielding before darkness took him. The river carried Carl's lifeless body downstream, the current tugging at him. Hours later, a search team found him tangled in a cluster of fallen branches, his body battered and lifeless. His chest was shredded, deep gashes marking where the bear's claws had struck. Blood still seeped from the wounds, staining the water around him. Back at the riverbank, the scene of the attack was harrowing. Carl's fishing rod lay bent and broken, its line tangled in the rocks. His bait box had been overturned, its contents scattered across the ground, smeared with blood. The cooler he had so carefully filled with fish was gone, dragged into the forest by the bear. Deep paw prints marked the mud, a trail of carnage leading into the trees. The searchers stood in silence, the reality of the wilderness before them. Kodiak Island, a place of stunning beauty, was also a place of untamed danger. For Carl Anders, the river he loved had become the scene of his untimely demise. But the river rushed on, oblivious to the pain it had witnessed. Forests surrounding the village, nestled deep in the Siberian wilderness, had always been quiet. On October 29, 2024, that silence was shattered. The morning had been unusually warm for late autumn, the air crisp but not biting. Children from the village's small school spilled into the schoolyard during recess, their laughter rising against the distant hum of the forest. The creature emerged silently, a shadow at the edge of the clearing. A massive grizzly, its fur matted with dirt, moved toward the chain-link fence that separated the schoolyard from the wilderness. It took its time, sniffing the air. The animal was watching the cluster of children closely. Then, with a burst of power, it lunged at the fence, sending a shudder through the flimsy barrier. Alyosha, the first child to notice, froze mid-step, his face pale with fear. Others turned to look. Confusion quickly turned to panic. A teacher standing near the playground's edge shouted a warning, her voice sharp and piercing. The children scattered, their high-pitched screams slicing through the air as they ran toward the school building. But the bear breached the fence with terrifying ease. The rusted metal buckled under its weight, collapsing in a tangle that barely slowed its momentum. It charged forward, each step pounding the earth with a brutal rhythm. It was massive, a living tank of muscle and claw, moving with a speed that belied its size, and it wanted nothing more than to attack. The first child it reached was Alyosha. He had tripped in the chaos, landing hard on the dirt. The bear swiped at him with a single paw, the blow sending the boy sprawling. Blood sprayed in an arc as the claws tore through his back, the sharp tang of it filling the air. The bear reared up, roaring, its guttural sound loud enough to rattle windows. Teachers raced forward, their faces pale with terror. One grabbed a stick, wielding it like a weapon, while another screamed for the children to enter. The bear turned on them, its eyes wild, its movements feral and erratic. It charged again, slamming into a small wooden play structure which splintered under its weight. A teacher stumbled backward, her foot catching on the debris as the bear descended on another child, a boy named Mikhail. The boy, no more than 8, tried to crawl away. The bear caught him by the leg, dragging him back with an almost lazy swipe. Its jaws snapped down, crushing his little torso in a spray of blood. Mikhail's screams choked into silence as the bear shook him like a rag doll. Other children had managed to make it inside the school, but the bear's focus was relentless. It barreled toward the remaining group of children, still scrambling to safety, its claws raking the earth as it lunged forward. Natasha, a 9-year-old girl, fell just feet from the door, her small hands clutching at the steps. The bear reached her in 2 strides, its paw slamming down on her back with a sickening crunch. Inside the building, chaos reigned. Teachers pulled sobbing children into classrooms, locking doors and dragging desks to create makeshift barricades. One teacher frantically dialed for help on her phone, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. The dispatcher's voice on the other end was calm and detached, but the reality outside was anything but. Undeterred by the fleeing children, the bear turned on a group of teachers who had rushed to shield the last students. One of them, Lev, a wiry man with a rake in hand, was guarding 2 little girls, twins. Lev swung wildly at the animal. The rake glanced off its head, barely phasing it. With a low growl, the bear charged, knocking Lev to the ground. But it didn't stop. The twins, little Nadia and Tatiana, were its real target. In an instant, it pinned them both with its massive paws and tore into them with a ferocity that froze the others in place. A sharp crack split the air, followed by another. A pair of hunters, alerted by the commotion, had arrived on the scene, their rifles aimed and ready. The first shot struck the bear in the shoulder, causing it to stagger. It roared in defiance, a guttural mix of pain and rage. The second shot hit its flank, but the beast refused to go down. The bear turned on the hunters, its movements slower now, but no less determined. It charged toward them, its massive frame kicking up dirt and debris. One of the hunters fired again, the bullet striking just above the bear's right eye. The animal stumbled mid-stride, its body jerking awkwardly before collapsing onto its side. It let out one final ragged breath before falling still. The schoolyard was silent, except for the distant wails of sirens and the muffled sobs of children inside the building. The bear's lifeless form lay amidst the wreckage of the yard, its fur matted with blood, its body a gruesome reminder of the violence that had unfolded. By the time authorities arrived, the scene was one of devastation. 5 children lay dead, their small bodies crumpled in the dirt where they had fallen. Teachers huddled inside the building, their faces streaked with tears, their hands bloodied from useless attempts to save the children. The hunters stood near the bear's body, their faces grim, their rifles still in hand. In the following days, the village grappled with the horror of what had occurred. Questions arose. Why had the bear wandered so close to the school? Why had it attacked with such unrelenting aggression? Wildlife experts speculated that the unusually warm weather had disrupted the bear's hibernation cycle, driving it out of the forest for food. Others blamed deforestation, claiming that the bear's habitat had been encroached upon, forcing it into closer contact with humans. But for the villagers, these explanations offered little solace. The scars left by the attack, both physical and emotional, would take far longer to heal. The once innocent sound of children laughing in the schoolyard was now a painful reminder of lives cut tragically short. And though the bear had been killed, its memory lingered like a shadow over the village, a stark reminder of the thin line between nature and civilization. The wind cut across the frozen expanse of Hudson Bay, biting and sharp. Dr. Laura adjusted her hood, her breath visible in the freezing air as she studied the shifting ice. Her team moved around her, cataloging samples, taking measurements, and noting the subtle changes in the Arctic's fragile ecosystem. The silence of the wilderness was heavy, broken only by the crunch of boots and the distant groan of ice plates shifting against one another. That afternoon, they saw something that gave them pause. At first, it was a speck on the horizon, seemingly moving with purpose over the jagged ice. They thought it was an illusion, a trick of light and ice for a while. As it came closer, though, Laura recognized the unmistakable shape of a polar bear. Its massive body was worn, its ribs visible even through thick fur. This was no idle wanderer, a predator pushed to the brink. Desperate, the team froze as the bear approached, its black eyes locked onto the camp. Laura's instincts kicked in, and she grabbed the flare gun from her belt. With a sharp trigger pull, a red streak shot into the air, hissing and crackling. The bear stopped, startled, its ears flattening against its head. For a moment, she thought it might retreat. It didn't. Instead, it circled wide around the camp, pacing just beyond the range of their defenses. The bear's movements were deliberately calculated. This was an exquisite hunter at work. It stopped, sniffed the air every few minutes, and edged closer. The scent of food of humans drew it forward. Laura barked orders, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her chest. The team scrambled to pack what they could, abandoning their research to retreat to the emergency shelter, a reinforced structure designed to withstand the Arctic's harshest elements. They moved quickly, hauling essential gear inside as the bear stalked closer. The shelter was small but sturdy, with thick metal panels insulated against the cold. Laura bolted the door as the last team member rushed inside, her heart pounding. Through a narrow slit of reinforced glass, she watched the bear approach the abandoned camp. It tore into their equipment with brutal efficiency. Tents collapsed under the weight of its massive paws. Storage crates splintered as it clawed through them, scattering supplies across the ice. The bear's frustration grew as it found nothing substantial to eat. It roared, the sound deep and guttural, reverberating through the shelter like a physical force. Inside, the team huddled together, their faces pale and drawn. Hours passed, but the bear showed no signs of leaving. It circled the shelter, its claws scratching against the metal walls. Laura tried to calm them, but the bear's relentless growls and heavy thuds slowly made them lose their composure. Panic set in when the first dent appeared in the shelter's wall. The bear's hunger made it bold. It slammed its body against the structure, testing its strength. Each impact sent shudders through the floor, shaking loose bits of frost from the ceiling. The shelter, designed to withstand storms and snowdrifts, was no match for a starving polar bear's determination. Laura searched the room for anything they could use as a weapon. They had flares, a utility knife, and a single fire extinguisher. It wasn't enough. She knew it, and so did the others. The next impact was harder and more violent. A crack formed near the base of one wall. The bear had found a weak point. Its claws tore at the edges of the panel, making the screeching sound unbearable. The crack widened, letting in icy air that swirled through the shelter like a death knell. The bear's head appeared through the gap, its black nose twitching as it inhaled their scent. It growled, its breath visible in the frigid air, and began to push its way inside. Laura fired another flare, aiming at the bear's face. The bright burst startled it, but only for a moment. It recoiled, shook its head, and returned with even greater ferocity. The team backed into the far corner, their makeshift weapons clutched tightly. The bear was inside now, its massive body filling the confined space. It roared again, the sound deafening in the enclosed shelter. Laura swung the fire extinguisher, striking its shoulder. The blow glanced off, barely slowing it down. One of the team members tried to stab at it with the utility knife, but the bear swatted him aside like a rag doll. He hit the wall with a sickening thud and crumpled to the floor, unmoving. Another flare went off, this time at point-blank range. The bear roared in pain, but it didn't stop. It couldn't. Hunger had consumed it, leaving no room for fear. Laura's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. There was none. The bear was too strong, too determined. It moved through the shelter with a terrifying purpose, its claws raking against walls and bodies alike. One by one, her team fell, their screams cut short as the bear's weight bore down on them. Finally, it was silent. The shelter was a scene of devastation. Blood smeared the walls, pooling on the icy floor. Equipment lay scattered, broken, and useless. The bear stood amidst the carnage, its sides heaving with exertion. It nosed at the remains, its black eyes dull and lifeless, then proceeded to feed. The wind picked up, howling through the gap in the shelter's wall. It carried away the last traces of life, sweeping over the frozen bay like a cold, indifferent witness. By morning, the storm would cover the tracks, erasing the evidence of what had happened here. The research team was reported missing. A search party found their camp torn apart and scattered across the ice weeks later. But the story of that night, the terror of those final moments, would never truly be known. In the end, only the wind remained. Eric crouched low behind a dense cluster of shrubs, his camera lens trained on the lone grizzly bear rummaging along the riverbank. The golden afternoon light filtered through the pine trees, casting a warm glow over the scene. The bear, a massive creature with a thick coat of dark brown fur, pawed at the gravelly shoreline, flipping rocks in search of fish. Eric's heart pounded with the thrill of being close to one of nature's most powerful predators. This was the shot he had been waiting for. For 3 days, he tracked signs of bear activity in the backcountry of Wyoming. Scattered paw prints in the mud, claw marks on tree trunks, and the occasional clump of fur snagged on branches had led him to this spot. His persistence had paid off. As the bear moved along the riverbank, Eric adjusted his position to get a better angle. He edged forward, careful to stay downwind, the crunch of his boots muffled by the soft moss beneath him. He knew the risks of getting too close, but reasoned that he was far enough away to avoid alarming the animal. Through the viewfinder, he snapped a series of shots, the bear's every movement captured in perfect detail. But then the bear stopped, its massive head lifted, ears swiveling as it sniffed the air. Eric froze, holding his breath. The bear turned, its dark eyes locking onto him through the foliage. The seconds stretched, a taut silence filling the space between predator and intruder. Eric's heart raced, his pulse drumming loudly in his ears. He slowly backed away, trying to create distance, but his foot slipped on a loose rock in his haste to retreat. The sharp clatter echoed through the trees. The bear growled a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the ground. It stood on its hind legs, its full height towering over Eric, and swung its head back and forth, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. Eric's stomach sank. He had trapped the bear between the river and the thick brush behind him. There was no escape for either of them. The bear dropped to all fours and charged. Eric's survival instincts kicked in, and he bolted for the nearest tree. His legs burned as he scrambled up the trunk, the rough bark biting into his palms. Below, the grizzly closed the distance with terrifying speed, its claws ripping into the earth as it barreled forward. Eric reached for the next branch, his hands trembling, but the bear was too fast. With a roar, it rose on its hind legs and swiped at him. The impact was brutal. The bear's paw struck Eric's side, knocking him from the tree and sending him crashing to the ground. He hit the earth, the wind knocked out of him. Dazed and gasping, he struggled to roll onto his stomach, but the bear was faster. Eric's mind raced, grasping for anything that might save him. He remembered the advice he'd read countless times in survival guides. Play dead. His body went limp. His arms splayed out as he pressed his face into the dirt. Every instinct screamed at him to fight back, to run, but he forced himself to remain still. The bear growled again, a sound so close it seemed to rattle his bones. He felt its hot breath against his neck, a disgusting mix of fish and decay. The bear's nose pressed against him, snuffling as it investigated this new threat. Its massive paw prodded at his back, flipping him onto his side. Eric kept his eyes closed, his breath shallow, even as the bear's claws grazed his skin, tearing through his jacket and leaving stinging gashes on his chest and arms. The weight of the bear was crushing. It pawed at his legs, pressing down hard enough to bruise, then bit at the straps of his backpack, yanking him sideways. Eric's muscles screamed in protest but stayed limp, his body slack and motionless. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The bear huffed and circled him, its frustration obvious. Eric's heart pounded so hard he feared the bear could hear it. He dared not open his eyes, even as the animal nudged him with its nose one last time. Finally, the grizzly let out a low, rumbling exhale. Eric heard the heavy crunch of its paws retreating, the sound growing fainter as it moved back toward the river. He waited, every muscle locked in place until he could no longer hear the bear's movements. Only then did he open his eyes. Pain radiated through his body as he struggled to sit up. Blood soaked through his shirt, the gashes on his torso oozing dark red. His side throbbed where the bear had struck him, likely fracturing a rib or two. His camera lay a few feet away, its lens shattered, a cruel reminder of how close he had come to capturing the perfect shot and how close he had come to dying. Eric staggered to his feet, clutching at the tree for support. His surroundings spun, his vision blurred by exhaustion and adrenaline. He knew he couldn't stay here. The bear might return, and he was in no condition to face it again. He stumbled along the riverbank, his movements slow and unsteady. Each step sent jolts of pain through his battered body, but he pressed on, driven by the faint hope of finding help. After what felt like an eternity, he heard voices, distant but unmistakable. A group of hikers appeared, their faces a mix of concern and shock as they rushed to his aid. They helped him to a makeshift seat, wrapped his wounds, and gave him water. One radioed for assistance, and Eric was airlifted to safety within hours. Eric gazed down at the forest below as the helicopter lifted him from the wilderness. The riverbank where the encounter had unfolded was a small, insignificant speck in the vast expanse of wilderness. The bear, somewhere down there, continued its hunt for survival, just as he had fought for his.